Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Krenke. I'm at the Cloquet Forestry Center, and today's webinar is Minnesota Forest Understory Plants ID for Native Plant Communities with Associate Professor Andy David. So what I will do is give a little bit of an overview and then turn it over to Andy. When you look at your screen in the upper left-hand corner, you can provide questions through the chat pod. So you type in your questions and then press that little brain, and Andy and I will be able to see your questions, and Andy will answer them when he can. Andy's presentation will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have more questions and answers at the end. So Andy is an associate professor in the Department of Forestry at the University of Minnesota. He graduated in forest genetics. Historically, geneticists teach plant identification in a forest department. Since 2005, Professor David has co-taught identification of plants, forest plants, with Phil Splett at the Cloquet Forestry Center during the summer session. He currently teaches dendrology on the St. Paul campus during the fall semester. So I want to turn it over to Andy today, and before I do that, we have 12 participants representing Minnesota DNR Forestry, U.S. Forest Service, Superior and Chippewa National Forests, County Forestry, Industry, Blandon, and Boise. We have a consulting forester online in NRCS. So I want to welcome all of you today, and I want to turn it over to Andy David. Andy?
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone. This is a little odd. I'm used to standing out with a group of folks out in the field or in a classroom, and it's a little odd for me to give a presentation like this basically to my computer screen. If you have questions, go ahead and type them up as Mike indicated. I'll do my best to see them. If not, Mike, just give me a holler if I'm missing one. But feel free to ask them at any time. With that, let's begin. We're going to give this presentation today based on native plant communities that DNR recognizes. And we wanted to look at roughly plants from 10 of them. Obviously not all the plants in all 10, but in the fire-dependent and the mesic hardwood communities, those are the 5 we'll be looking at in each one of those 2 general classifications. And just to let you know how I did this, I went to each of these species frequency and cover sheets from Minnesota DNR native plant communities and pulled off all of the species under Forbes ferns and fern allies and shrubs and low shrubs, if you will, and grasses and sedges, and then I put them in a large matrix based on each one of those species and native plant communities. Then I wanted to look and see if I could find those that had at least a minimum 20% frequency. In other words, if you were in an FDN 43, you would find them on that type of site at least 20% of the time. Anything lower than that really isn't very helpful, at least in my estimation, on a regular basis. I avoided all the common species, i.e. those species that occurred in all 5 FDNs or all 5 MHNs, or there were some that occurred across all 10 sites. Those are relatively common. I didn't think they were necessarily that difficult. Maybe that's a webinar for another day. Once I did that, you recognize there are no silver bullet species. There's nothing that you will find at 75, 85, 90% of the time that is indicative of only one particular site. So, the best we had, was down at the bottom. You see kidney-leaved violet, and that only shows up on FDN 43 sites according to the Minnesota DNR, but it only shows up 15% of the time. That's just not very helpful. So things like that we're not going to cover. So what are we going to cover today? Here's our list of species and occurrences. Hopefully, this is an audacious list. We got a bunch to look at. Some of them will go more in depth than others, and you also get an idea as to where they show up based on this little graphic. MHN 44 sites are odd. I'm not sure what the deal is, but after looking at these 10 sites and all the species, there's not much that is in MHN44 itself or on, one NPC either side of that, MHN35 or MHN45. And so really the only representative you see from that will be lady fern. That's, if you're looking for a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, you might consider that. Let's see, where are we? We're going to move on here. So in the shrub layer, these are the 7 that we want to look at relatively quickly. And we'll start with green alder. Let's see. We've got a question. Where did I get this list? And that would be from the Minnesota DNR Native Plant Communities booklet, which I'm quickly looking on my shelf if I can pull it off. Native Plant Communities of Minnesota, Field Guide 2D. Maybe we can answer your question later by sending you a direct email. But that book is available. There are 3 different versions of it for the 3 different larger provinces in Minnesota. So that's what I'm working from. Green alder. Alnus viridus. You can see at the top I'll have the bar of NPCs and which one it occurs in at the first page of each one of these. And I typically do a form and then leaves and then fruits and flowers, and then we go on to the next one. So in terms of form and site, green alder requires light and moist soils. Okay, so you're not going to find it really in shade. It's more of an edge species or out in the open, as you can see from these 2 pictures. The one on the left gives you a sense that it's it is a shrub, maybe to 13 feet tall, so not very tall, but several stems, multiple stems, not a single stemmed shrub. FDN sites aren't necessarily known for their moist soils, but the 32 and 33, FDN 32 and 33 is going to have more moisture than the ones on the left, FDN 12 and FDN 22. If you're not familiar with this system, FD stands for fire dependent and is northern floristic region, which is in the northern part of the state. The first number is the moisture gradient from 0 to 9, 1 being fairly low, and 2 is a nutrient level from 0 to 9. Again, 0 being very low, and 2 is a fairly low nutrient gradient. As we work through these, and if you recognize some of them, you'll get an idea as to where they belong, and you can see them in your mind's eye from where you can see in your mind's eye where you've seen them before. Shrub, 13 feet with several stems. Buds. Unusual for alders, these buds are not stalked. They are sessile, or nearly so, with 3 bud scales. The other alder in Minnesota is tag alder or speckled alder, and it would have 2 bud scales. Leaves, alternate, finely serrate, unlike speckled alder, and ovate, much more so than the rhomboid speckled alder. Flowers, like all members of Betulaceae, or I should say most, not all, there's one exception, they have preformed male catkins. You can see in the picture on the left, kind of in between the leaves. Oh, wait a minute, we're going to get the little, let's get this in here. And I can grab them. There are your preformed male catkins. And then they also have the female catkins that look, once they've let their seeds out and they'll hang on for a year or 2, they look like small woody pine cones. So as I tell the students, if you're walking through the woods and you see a shrub that has what looks like small pine cones on it but no needles, this is likely to be one of the alders, either green or speckled alder. Bark, light gray in color with lenticels. I don't have a good picture of the bark, but if you know more common speckled alder, then you realize that that isn't light gray, that's more maroon, but the green alder is light gray. Okay. Sweet fern, Comptonia peregrina. This is a small shrub, under 3 feet, often clonal in nature, so once one gets started, it can also reproduce asexually through the roots and send up a new above-ground portion. Dry, sandy soils. Notice we're FDN 22, FDN 32. These are relatively dry. and low fertility, often associated with wild blueberries. You find these two back to back. In fact, there's a spot we do some of our field work. Love to go there during blueberry season, in part to collect the blueberries, but also because this particular species is very aromatic. Okay? When you pick up some of these leaves in your hand and just kind of rub them together, you get a very unique smell. Some people say it's somewhat like cinnamon, but it's also possible on a still day with the sun overhead to actually smell that without even crushing them. I mean, you can also walk into an area and say, ah, sweet fern is around someplace. Linear leaves deeply serrate. And you can tell, I want to click on this again and bring this over. Let's come here. There we go. There are the deep serrations on the leaves that cut almost to the midrib. In some cases, they're almost right there to the midrib. Very aromatic when crushed. This is a little odd. Sometimes you'll see these burrs on the on sweet fern. Right here's one. This actually is the fruiting body, the mature fruit. And what we see at the very front here are male flowers releasing the pollen. But that burr in the back, occasionally you will see them, and it's not a growth, but it will be a way to help you identify this definitely as sweet fern. Okay. Leatherwood, completely different species and a completely different range of sites. According to the DNR's NPC book, we're going to pick up leatherwood on two different sites at opposite ends of the mesic hardwood spectrum, MHN 35 and MHN 47. I'm not sure why you wouldn't find it in between those sites. This is typically where you're going to find it. Indicative of rich woods. So if you take a look at the last number here, we've got a 5 and a 7. Those are fairly fertile sites. And there's adequate moisture for good hardwood growth, especially on the MHN 47 site. This is a smaller shrub, 2 to 3 meters in height, so say right around 10-foot max, typically with a single stem, somewhat unusual for shrubs. Horizontal branching, you'll notice that here's your single stem, and then you start to get these more horizontal branches, or they come up and then become horizontal. Once you see and start to recognize this tree, this shrub rather, you'll notice the form is very very easy to identify the species based on form, especially once it's in leaf and everything out in the woods is in leaf. It's fairly easy to pick this one out. Horizontal branching found as individuals under a canopy, i.e. it's not clonal. You tend to find them as scattered individuals. But this thickened trunk, if you will, and then only about 10 foot tall, and then the branches that become horizontal, slightly upswept at the tips. Leaves, oval, entire, meaning there are no serrations on the edges, it's just a straight edge. Relatively a dull color. It's a dull yellow-green. It's not a bright green, it's a little duller. No shine, no gloss to it, with black spots in yellow areas. And on this one, we can see right on the edge here, we're starting to pick up some of the yellow spots, and there's one yellow with a little bit of black on the interior of it. If you see those spots on the leaves and that dull yellow, that's leatherwood. Bingo. Another way you can see this is if we take a look at the stems. I like to think of this as an old-fashioned radio antenna. If you remember from a radio that used to sit on your kitchen counter, and you had that antenna that went in and out, and each piece would slide into the other. These stems look just like that. And that if you could take the end and slap them towards the inside of the trunk, all of those would fit inside the other. So last year's growth down here is larger than this year's growth here. There's a complete circle all the way around that's larger than the newest year of growth. Leaves turn yellow in fall, roughly about the same color as those yellow spots that are on them. Flowers, yellow and before the leaves in early spring. And that's a harbinger of spring. Some people just kind of look for that. When those come out, it's about time to be tapping maple syrup and collecting sap. The fruit itself is a smallish ball. I only saw one picture that I could use, and it really wasn't even worthwhile because it was hard to tell exactly what it was. But a small ball-like or berry-like drupe, if you will. They're the yellow flowers before the leaves. Make sure you're tapping by the time those come out. So, all right, let's look a little farther on the NPC range, farther to the richer sites, the more moisture sites, and look at swamp red currant, Rubus triste. Moist to wet rich sites. Low shrub to about 3 feet tall, and even that would be a very tall one. Clue here is without spines or thorns on the stems. Often our currants have got some sort of prickle, either a spine or a true thorn. This one doesn't. It's clean, if you will. Often spreading or reclining, so it doesn't have a lot of ability to stand upright on its own. The taller it gets, the more it's going to be falling over or leaning on something else. Leaves resemble maple with the 3 to 5 lobes, but alternate. Remember, all your maples are opposite with the exception of alternate leaf maple, alternate leaf dogwood rather. It's a dogwood, but all the maples are opposite. We'll do it that way. Larger than most ribes. Leaves are larger than most ribes, 5 lobes. And the bottom 2 are here, but very, very small. One here on the left and one here on the right. These lobes are often very minute or underdeveloped. So in general, 5-lobed, cut less than halfway to the midrib. And there's your cut, and the midrib is here. So this indentation occurs, but it doesn't get to halfway to the midrib, so it's less than halfway to the midrib. Flowers, dull, slightly purplish, dish-shaped, pendant racemes from the axils. So here we are with our racemes of flowers, slightly purplish, very dish-shaped, very flat-looking, coming from the axils where the new leaf material for the year is coming out. We also get those racemes for flowers. And then, of course, the berries are going to show up on those racemes, bright red, without hairs, without prickles on the fruit. So here, swamp red currant, think of it as something that's not very, not an aggressive upright grower. You know, maybe 3 feet tall at the most, leaning on something or falling over, reclining, large maple-like leaf, but no stems, no spines, no thorns, either on the stems or on the fruit. All right, we'll move on. Brownleaf dogwood. This species kind of goes across both fire-dependent sites and mesic hardwood sites. Requires a little bit of moisture and a little bit of kind of average fertility, if you will. Tall shrub to about 10, 11 feet, 1 to several trunks. I've always seen it with multiple trunks, usually 2 or 3, not as many as we saw in green alder, but certainly more than we would see in leatherwood. Key here, red spots or blotches on both young and old stems. If you take a look on the left, you'll see these red to purplish splotches on a green stem. It's probably a year old. Even on older material, you'll get a red or purplish, dark maroon splotches, much larger than you see these spots here. And on the new twig of the year, if you will, you also have the purple on the green, on the yellow-green twigs. Very, very key way of identifying roundleaf dogwood. Leaves, opposite, as all dogwoods are, with the exception of alternate leaf dogwood, entire oval to orbicular acuminate, meaning that there is a small pointed tip. We call it a drip tip. If there was rain or dew coming off it, you see it just kind of run down to the end and drip off here. Your acuminate tip is a drip tip. Arcuate venation, meaning the veins come from the midrib, they run out to the edge or the margin, and then follow the margin just a brief point. This is characteristic of dogwoods. All dogwoods have this, so that arcuate venation you can recognize. And the fruit was described as gaudy. I thought that was an interesting term, but here you have this blue droop on a red panicle. And it's not a deep blue, it's kind of just a light dusting of blue, but the color contrast is fairly strong. If you happen to see these, you can start thinking roundleaf dogwood. Here's a good example of the leaf itself and how round or oval it is. And that's a little more so than you would find here, but still, even this one is oval, not necessarily orbicular or circular. All right. Thimbleberry. This one also splits across FDN and MHN sites. It looks like it needs a fair amount of water, so it's at a level 4, and can tolerate, a better site, but also pick up enough nutrition in a 43. Once you understand and recognize thimbleberry, and once you've had the berries themselves, then you'll probably see it very frequently. And these are some of the things we want to think about. An edge species, especially after harvest or fire, you'll find it needs light, and it's often right on that, on that edge along a pathway, along a roadway. It'll show up after harvest. It'll show up after fire because it does need some light. Small shrub, to about 8 feet. That would be a really large one. Most are under 4. It is clonal, so it will spread by root suckers. It canes without spines. So it's related to raspberries. It's in the Rubus genus, but it has no spines, no prickles like you would see on red raspberry, or if you're familiar with blackberries at all. This one is clean. So it makes it easy to kind of wade through and collect berries from. Leaves, 5-lobed, soft, fuzzy, very, very pubescent, especially on the underside, and large, 8 inches. And we don't have anything that large in our red raspberries or our blackberries. Fruit, white flowers that are also very large, then this red raspberry-like fruit. Incredibly edible, very tasty, but softer and with lots of seeds. If you don't like seeds in your fruit, you're not going to like this. If you can get past that, it's very tasty. They're so soft that it's very hard to do any commercial cultivation of them. They really just don't keep well. So if you find them, go ahead and eat them. You're not going to be able to save them. You also might want to look out if it's in the wrong time of the year. Bears will frequent thimbleberries as well, so you can be fighting with the bears for some tasty foods. Large leaves, again, large flowers, and large fruit. That's really the way to think about thimbleberry. Hairy honeysuckle, and if I don't miss my guess, this is the last of our shrub species. Again, cuts across FDN and MHN sites. Better FDN sites than the lowest of the MHN sites in terms of moisture and fertility. Low, viney shrub, about 10 feet tall, up to. So this is another one where we don't have an upright growing, free to grow condition. It's not like bush honeysuckle. It's not like fly honeysuckle. This one actually also needs a little bit of support. Leaves. Opposite. Entire margin, but ciliate. So what you have are these tiny, tiny little hairs on the side, on the margin of the leaf, and on the petiole. Hence, hairy honeysuckle or Lonicera hirsuta. If something's hirsute, it's hairy or bearded, if you will. I think we've got a better, here's a better picture of this, right? Now you can see all those tiny little hairs, both on the margin of the leaf, on the petioles, and on the stem itself. So hairy honeysuckle. That one should be fairly easy. Here's a big clue. If you get a chance to see it in bloom, these large mass of yellow flowers, paired, because honeysuckles always do things in pairs, yellow-orange and clustered at the very end, the very terminal. And those terminals are unique in that the leaves at the terminals fuse around the stem into a saucer shape. And you can see it over here on the right. You have the leaves have fused and made this single saucer-shaped leaf, if you will, and then the flowers on the outside of that are distal to that, as will be the fruits. And here's another close-up version of what that those leaves have come together and formed almost a dish-shaped leaf, if you will, and all the flowers and profusion on the outside of that. Fruit, orange-red berries in stalked clusters. And so if you're lucky enough to see those berries, they will be exactly where these flowers would have been, and they will be paired as the flowers are too. But it would just be like, it appears a cluster, orange-red berries. All right. Now, leaving the shrubs, and before we do we have any questions offhand? I know I'm going through these a little fast, but I would encourage you, if you do have questions, to go ahead and just type them in. Mike has added something here. Native Plant Communities of Minnesota Field Guide. There are 3 in the series, and they can be purchased from the Minnesota DNR, and there's a phone number. I believe everyone can see that, so if you're interested in that, you can go call them. I believe you can find them online and kind of get a sneak peek first, decide if you want to do them. I think, Mike, if I remember right, you folks do some, SFEC does some education in recognizing these, but outdoors as opposed to indoors like this webinar. In any case, ground layer. There are about 8 different species we want to take a look at in the next 25 minutes or so. The last 2 will be kind of just a quick comparison, so we should be able to pull this off. You know, as I was preparing this seminar, my oldest son came up to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm getting ready to do a webinar and put it together." He said, "Here, take a look at this. What do you think of this as a common name?" And his eyes just kind of lit up. I have no idea why we call it bastard toadflax, but that's the name, and it's all over the literature. Comandra umbellata. You're going to find this on the driest, most sterile sites in the state. FDN 12 is about as dry and unproductive as you can get. And if you take a look at this picture, you get a sense of what this species is growing on. Sterile, sandy soils, typically very deep sands, maybe in association with the occasional blueberry plant or some grasses. Herbaceous plant, very small, less than a foot tall. There's not a lot of fertility here to put on good growth. Semi-parasitic on plant roots, but green. So it's capable of photosynthesizing, but it has to be in association with another plant that's alive. So it's kind of an odd parasitism method, but it does work to keep this plant alive and growing. Leaves, alternate, thick, oblong, about 1 inch in length, shorter at the terminal. So they tend to be pointed, as you see at the top here. Let me get the little cursor back and drag it over. You have these pointed tips, and then down lower you have, towards the stem you have wider tips or wider distance between the leaves. The concept of being thick in a leaf is a way of preserving moisture, the way of conserving moisture. The ultimate example of that is a cactus. But this is one way of adapting to a dry site. Typically your dry site species tend to have thicker leaves or leaves that roll at the edges to help conserve moisture so things don't, water doesn't leave through the stomates as quickly. Another shot of it on the right-hand side here. One thing we ought to look at, right in the middle, all these are flowers, but they're past their prime, and right in the middle you have a developing ovary with the seeds inside. So let's move this along. Put that out of the way. Flowers, small, white, clustered at the terminal in a panicle, often frequented by eastern-tailed blues. And I saw that picture and I just had to put it in here. The coloring is really nice on that. I think that came out of Wikimedia Commons. I'd give you an idea of what flowers on bastard toadflax look like. All right, let's do another one. Pussytoes. Antennaria, neglecta. Again, the extreme driest and most sterile of our sites, FDN sites. You may know this as field pussytoes, or you may know it as everlasting. I think I learned it as everlasting, but others call it, pussytoes or field pussytoes. Dry, infertile soils again, low a creeping ground cover, less than 6 inches tall, perennial and evergreen. If I'm not mistaken, this is even green under the snow. Definitely grows clonally as well. I've got a patch of this in my yard, and it would typically get mowed, and you don't have to worry about the mower hitting it because it's so low. But one year I wanted to figure out what would happen, and I just let it go. And these large stems came up out of it and then opened, and there were these just kind of a pinkish purplish flower, and then these achenes came out. And I recognized then it was the fruiting structure, and that if I didn't mow, I could get those every year. Of course, I thought it was kind of cool. My wife thought I was nuts, but so be it. Leaves, spatulate. They look like spatulas, very narrow, or ladle, if you will, very narrow at the throat, and then very wide at the very end. Covered in a dense white hair. These aren't quite as dense as you might see. Some of them over here on the right, you can see those hairs on that spatulate-shaped leaf. If you've got a good imagination, you might see cat toes in these. You know, you've got all those little toes on the cat with all the hairs coming across the top. I think that's where it gets the field pussy toes from. There's your flowers on a tall stalk arising out of the basal leaves, pinkish white, and then once that fruit develops, it's released as a single-seeded achene, much like dandelions are. But this fruiting body will stand probably a foot to 18 inches off the ground, so definitely much taller than the basal leaves. American spikenard. Again, it occurs at both ends of the mesic hardwood spectrum, MHN 35, MHN 47, a perennial herb. So now we're starting to get into things that create a new above-ground portion every year. So everything we see here is created new, arises from a bud that's below ground, and it comes up at each spring, and then it dies back each fall. The root system is persistent. It is a perennial, but the above-ground portion is recreated each year. 2 to 6 feet tall, a very stout stem, often found in shade. So you're going to find this in woodlots that have been, or forests that have been undisturbed for quite some time. Leaves look compound. So they're not, they look not like simple leaves, a stem and a petiole and a leaf, but they look like a stem and a rachis and leaflets off the rachis. They have 9 to 21 heart-shaped leaflets with acuminate tips. So here are our leaflets. We can kind of count them off if you want. And they look compound because this would be, the rachis and then the leaflets off the rachis. But in reality, because it is a herbaceous perennial, we know that all of this, everything from the ground up, there's your stout stem and splitting, all of this comes from a single bud right here down below the ground, initiated in the fall, overwintered in the spring, comes up and produces all of this. So if you look on this stem, you will not find another bud because all of this is one leaf and it's going to have a single bud down below. There's our acuminate tips. And typically what happens is we have a stem that then branches and forms a new set of, if you will, a leaf with leaflets, and then you have another branch on the other side, and you can see the edge of the leaflets here. And then in this case, off of that stem, we get a flowering portion or a flowering stem. Let's take a look at that. Aurelia racemosa, one of the things you can really pick this out with is the huge inflorescence. Many tiny white flowers arranged in this large, showy inflorescence early in summer, becoming dark purple berries, for us inedible. This might look like Sambucus pubens or Sambucus canadensis, red-berried elder, but the inflorescence is a spike as opposed to a broad-topped flat head. So American spikenard, a much larger spike-like inflorescence than you would find on the red-berried elders. Otherwise, leaflets are going to look somewhat similar. Red-berried elder, of course, is a true shrub, and that has a permanent above-ground portion. This is an herbaceous perennial, all arising de novo each year from below ground. There's a close-up of what the fruits look like in later summer as they're beginning to turn color and go to this dark blue to black. Right now, they're kind of in the transition period. Blue cohosh, way over on the extreme right, the richest, the wettest soils. This is a site indicator for a very productive site. Again, you find this one in deep shade. You can find it in deep shade. It's very tolerant. Another herbaceous perennial, so everything above ground renewed each year, to about 2 feet tall, ternately compound. Ternately compound means that off that main stem, actually we're going to do it this way, we get a branching of the stem that forms 3, if you will, leaf-like areas, and they should be 1, 2, 3, and then from the center portion arises the flowering stalk. Let's just go back one, and then perhaps you can help envision that ternately branching portion starts right about where that green arrow is, and then you've got 1, 2, 3, and then the flowering stalk from the center of that, ternately compound. So, leaves, large, 3-branched, and again ternately branching themselves. So the stem is ternately branching, and then the leaflets are too. You see those coming up and then branching off on their own. Each leaflet, a cat's paw or tulip-shaped leaflets. I tend to see them as tulips right here, 1, 2, 3-lobed. That's probably the easiest way to see it, or down here there's 1, 2, 3 lobes here. Not rubbery. They're soft but not rubbery. They're not thick. They're relatively thin. A blue-green color. So there's a lot of blue in this. Even if you didn't have the blue fruits, this would be a blue-green color. An entire base, somewhat serrate at the tips. Excuse me. Let's see if we've got. Right, just taking an up-close view. Flowers, yellow on a fleshy stalk. So the stalk is fairly fleshy, fairly large. The fruit is an unusual blue color, and not unusual. It looks like a blueberry. Yeah, it does kind of look like a blueberry, but don't eat them. They're not good for you, and I wouldn't encourage anyone else to eat them either. But it's a very, I wouldn't say unusual blue color for a deep forest species. Let's put it that way. You usually find something like that in blueberries, and you associate that with open grown or light. This typically is in the shade. You often don't get this color in a deep forest setting.
Andy, you have a question?
Thank you.
Yep.
Spikenard berries poisonous. I saw them as inedible. I'm not sure if they're poisonous. Mimi, I'll have to look that up and get back to you. But my understanding from the research I did was that they are inedible. I don't know if they're poisonous. I'll look that up and send you an email. Jack-in-the-pulpit. Again, another herbaceous species that we're going to find on better MHN sites, MHN 45, 46, 47. 1 to 2 stems occurring almost as pairs, and then possibly with a fruiting stalk in the middle. And they don't fruit every year, but when they do, you typically have a fruiting stalk, and it comes up and you have a distinctive pulpit. Okay? And then, of course, you can envision Jack standing in here in the pulpit giving a homily to whoever will sit and listen, or stand and listen as the case may be. Leaves, usually 2 arising from a common point, and each one of them would have 3 leaflets. They look a lot like trillium. So if you know trillium, or you think you know trillium, let me give you a few hints on how to tell the 2 of them apart. These laterals are opposite, meaning that here you have the 2 lateral leaves of the 3, hence the name triphyllum, and these 2 actually are opposite, whereas trillium are a little set off, they're a little alternate. The other thing is they're asymmetric, so here you have a midrib, and one side is wider than the other side is. And the other key is on Jack-in-the-pulpit, we have this marginal vein. So you have a vein that actually parallels the margin here. And trillium does not have that. That's a dead giveaway for Jack-in-the-pulpit. So opposite leaves, leaflets if you will, inequilateral leaf, one side wider than the other, and then this marginal vein. That'll definitely help you identify Jack-in-the-pulpit if it doesn't have the pulpit. So this is kind of what we have, Jack-in-the-pulpit, and it's on the right we see it in its native environment. And this is typically what happens if you get if it decides to flower and you get that pulpit will eventually decay and break down, and that spadix will disintegrate, and it will leave behind a cluster of green berries. Those green berries mature through the summer, and as the leaves begin to decay, you can see here they're just starting to turn brown. Then those green cluster of berries turns brilliant red. And so soon you will have no green leaves at all. They'll be brown and on the ground, but you'll have this stalk that sticks up with this bright red cluster of berries. That's always Jack-in-the-pulpit. Nothing else looks like it. There's oxalic acid crystals in those berries, and they are extremely poisonous. Not much touches them or eats them at all, so you will often find them intact, and even as the first snowflakes start to fly, you can find this red stalk, or you can find a stalk with red berries on it. Wild leek. Again, extreme right, best moisture, best growing conditions. It's in the allium genus, related to shallots, related to onions, related to garlic. A common name other than wild leek is ramps, plural, herbaceous perennial, low to the ground, maybe a foot or so high, emerge early in the spring as a tuft of leaves with an onion smell. It's another one of those where you can walk into an area and you may smell it before you actually see it or realize that what you're amongst. And it'll be strong onion or strong garlic smell. On the right, you can see here kind of what they look like. This bulb in the ground and these roots help hold it in place. It can be a little hard to dig up, but especially out east, a rite of spring to go out and look for these and dig them up and put them into any one of a number of different, regional food dishes, if you will. Another close-up of what it might look like. It can be clonal. I'm going to go back a page here. And so you can get fields like this or areas that look like this, but often you may find it individually. Okay? I should say it's not actually clonal, but they will grow in groups. They will begin to, if you will, exclude other things and take out an area. One thing about wild leek is that leaves are light green, broad, smooth, parallel venation. They look like lilies. Okay? Parallel venation with purple tint below the leaves, white stalk and bulb. Much of that white stalk and bulb would be underground. You don't see it until you dig it up. Resemble scallions, if you will, and from the supermarket. Just about everything is edible. Leaves, stalk, and bulb, all edible. Recognize that soon after those leaves emerge in the spring, they begin to decay and fall apart. And once they do, then you have a stem that comes up from the base, and you get, excuse me, the flowers, which then develop into the fruit, which are these little black, shiny balls that look like black BBs, typically in groups of 3. You can see those pretty there. But the stalk, after the leaves degrade, unlike other onions and garlic, which keep the leaves and then produce the stalk. So this is a little different. Eventually you'll come out in the field and you'll just see these stalks with the flowers, or just see the stalks with the fruit on them. Okay. The last two we're going to take a look at, and then we'll be done. I know Mike's kind of sweating the time here. I want to take a look at lady fern and ostrich fern, in part because they look very, very similar and they have very different habitat requirements. Lady fern is relatively broad. You can find it on a couple of different FDN sites and all of the MHN sites. In that respect, it's not very helpful in determining what type of site you're on. It usually shows up as a clumped fern of single stems. It can become clonal, and it looks a lot like ostrich fern, roughly about 1.5 meters tall or so. And there's a good picture of what lady fern looks like as a single clumped fern. If you flip the blade over, and here we don't talk about, when we're dealing with ferns, we don't talk about leaves, we talk about blades. And we have the stipe, which comes out of the ground, and all the pinnae are on. But here is a blade. If you flip it over and look at the bottom, you'll see it's highly dissected. In other words, you have many, many pinnules coming off of here, and they're cut. Let's see, where's our green arrow? Many pinnules coming off, and they're cut deeply, if you will, to the midrib, highly dissected. It has a lacy appearance. And I'm going to go with some politically incorrect language, if you will. We're going to say it's lacy as a woman might wear lace, if you will. Sporangia, or the spores, occur on the underside of the blade if they're present. Not always present, but if they are, they'll show up as brown areas on the underside of these pinnae. And I don't see any sporangia on here, but they would be brown, if you will. And that's going to contrast with ostrich fern. Again, lady fern, the stipe, the stem is green with black protrusions. Okay? And these are fairly sharp. So be careful if you take your hand down there and just rub up on it. You can actually cut your hand. And again, somewhat politically incorrect, if you will, ladies need to shave their legs. All right? Smooth, green stipe with black protrusions and a lacy shape and appearance to the blade itself. Ostrich fern. This is much more limited in its sites than lady fern. It appears only on the better sites, MHN46, MHN47. Good moisture levels, good, fairly high fertility sites. So if you see ostrich fern, you know in general you're on a better site than you would if you're on looking at lady fern. So it helps to know how to tell the two apart. Again, a tall fern to about 1.5 meters, clumped with single stems, looks very, very similar, can be clonal as well, looks like lady fern. How do we tell them apart? The blade itself, blunt tip, all right? So it tends to come up and here the pinnae, and then you just kind of get a blunt tip to it. But tapering to the base. So in other words, you tend to get a taper in size, general taper to the base, but the tip is blunt. Not highly dissected, so it doesn't have that lacy appearance. The stem is smooth again, but it doesn't have any protrusions on it. Here's a huge difference if it's flowering or if it's producing spores, sporulating. The sporangia occur on a separate stalk that arises from the center of the cluster. So instead of having sporangia on the underside of the blade, it literally is on its own frond or stipe, if you will. Highly specialized. And the sporangia would be at the very tips in here. They're ready to release the spores. But this part remains above ground over winter. It'll be brown like this. Here's a picture early spring. The large blades that photosynthesize died last fall, decomposed over the winter. This is what's standing. In early spring, these spores are released. So ostrich fern, again, a couple of pictures just to kind of see the difference. Note on the left here, we have a tapering pinnae on the stipe to the ground. It tapers where it gets wider, and then at the top it's kind of blunt. If you go back and look a few, you'll see that lady fern comes to more of a point. This is blunt. And again here, the blunt tip pinnae that are not lacy, that are not highly dissected, and then tapering to the ground. And here right in the middle you can see that special stipe, that special frond, that's the sporangia on a stick, if you will. Okay. And Mike says, yeah, feel free to enter questions or comments here. That should be the end. That's the end. Bingo. One thing I'd like to ask, please feel free to put comments down. Does this work for you? Does it not? If you know you're working in certain NPCs and you think you might want to see one of these again in the future, put down what NPCs you'd like us to take a look at. We might be able to pull together another webinar. If you think this is too many species or too fast, say so. We might have to cut it back next time. I'll take all of your comments into consideration. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Andy. I see we have a couple questions, so we'll wait. Gary and Josh are typing right now. There we go.
Yep. Can I review the safe edible plants? Sure. I would say right off the top of my head, certainly the wild leek is edible. The ferns, lady fern and ostrich fern, when they're in the fiddlehead stage, in other words, when those blades are just first coming up, they are certainly edible. I've eaten honeysuckle fruits before, never in great quantities. Thimbleberry, definitely edible. That's one of my favorites. In fact, that's one of the reasons it made the list. Oh, what else is in there? The currants would be edible. They'd be really, really sour, but most people would make gooseberry jam or jelly or currant jam or jelly. If you had enough sugar, you can eat just about anything, if it's sour, that is. And that's all that's coming to mind off the top of my head. The slides available for review. In the past, I think Mike puts this whole, both the slides and the verbal portion, and that's archived at the SFEC website. Is that still the case, Mike?
That's correct. That's correct. We have about 25 or so webinars that are archived, and people can go back onto the SFEC website and review the program again.
Is it just the slides, or is it the slides and the audio portion as well?
The slides and the audio. Everything is taped by Iowa State University, and then it's archived on our SFPC website. Just
okay.
Go to the main page and then click on View Archived Websites on the upper left-hand corner of the page.
Okay. Kyle, I see you've got a question about the class-specific species. I'm looking, let's see, what issue is my book? I have July 2005 as a print date, and it typically, on an NPC, it is the last of 4 pages. So I'm just looking at MHN 35 now, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's actually the 5th page. So it's always the last page in the NPC description. And if you don't have that, you might want to look at, finding a newer version. How do you do NPCs in the winter? Half of them the rest of them I never had, so I guess the future would be beneficial. Yes. Finding out in the spring would be good, especially if you can get out there when things are flowering. That helps immensely. Learning to identify things without flowering parts, especially herbaceous material, can be particularly troublesome. Hopefully things are flowering this year. That will help you make that differentiation or figure out what areas are what NPC. Yep. Okay. I could potentially answer any other questions via email later. If you have any questions, just continue to post them, and Mike will send me transcripts. Mike, do you have any announcements that you want to give? Looks like we've got about 3.5 minutes.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to say thanks, Andy, for an excellent webinar again. This is the second one. You did one last year. You got feedback and fine-tuned what you did this year, so I appreciate it. And I'm finding that there's a lot of people out there, forest land managers, that want to improve their skills at identifying native plant community indicator plants, and you're helping us do that. So thanks, Andy. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
And then a couple announcements. We have our next webinar is on Lyme disease updates with Tom Greer, who's a microbiologist and Lyme support group coordinator out of Duluth. That'll be Tuesday, April 23rd. Tom presented last year as well. Lyme disease is one of those really big concerns in Minnesota, so I hope you can attend. We have one new webinar, or one new program. It's called Fungi and Mushrooms of the North Woods. And Larry Weber, he's an author of Fascinating Fungi of the North Woods, will be presenting with Roy Hagen. So this will be on Thursday, May 30th at the Cloquet Forestry Center. So if you're interested, go to our SFEC website and click on the calendar of events. Other than that, I thank you again, Andy. I thank all the participants for your interest. I want to thank the DNR again with Patty Thielen, who is helping to co-sponsor the webinar series. So hope your work goes well and hope everything goes good and we have a good spring, hopefully soon. So thanks again, Andy. Appreciate your time. With that, we'll call it quits for today. And Andy, let's stay online. Everybody else can be done.